All right, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about a UX or user experience research technique called card sorting. And what is card sorting? Card sorting is a way to uncover the mental model or the way people think about information. And it's most commonly used when it comes to things like information architecture. So for example, if you run a website that has categories where you sell things, and you want to know what categories to create or what things to put inside those categories, card sorting is perhaps a perfect way of going about learning how to do that. And card sorting also helps you understand, just in general, how people group or think about various pieces of information, which can then help you make better decisions later on. In many cases, we might think we know how people think, or we might think we know how our customers think that use, for example, an e-commerce shop, and how they want or how we think they want to navigate through. But there's a very big difference between thinking you know how someone behaves or thinks versus knowing how those people think by actually learning from your target user or customer or whatever it might be themselves. So that's where card sorting comes in and really helps you make better user-driven decisions rather than just decisions based on what you think you know. So there's a few different ways you can run card sorts, and I'll sort of briefly cover a bunch of things here. So there's open card sorts, which these are the cards that I've sort of made for this example. They're Subaru cars, but on each of these cards in an open card sort, someone could group them however they wanted, and then they would actually name that category themselves. So it's not a predefined thing. Like, all you're giving them is the cards. They'll run through them, they'll sort them, they'll group them, and then they'll tell you what they call those groups. Alternatively, there's a closed card sort. So a closed card sort, you still give them all these cards up front, but you would also give them categories to place those cards into. So rather than making their own categories, you would provide those categories, they would sort the cards into those categories, and then there you have it. And what's the difference between these two things? Like, why would you use open? Why would you use closed? I'll say in most cases, it's best to start with the open card sort to learn how people think about that information at the most highest level. As soon as you do a closed sort by providing categories, you're forcing people to put things into those categories, regardless if that's how they would normally do it if you did not provide the categories. So that's why you'd want to start with an open card sort, to learn what those categories should be. What's the most logical choice based on how people behave? So for example, if 70 or 75% of the people who you have run this card sort create similar categories or groups of categories in an open card sort, you could then feel fairly confident that you could use those categories or a mixture of those categories in a closed card sort. And then in the closed card sort, where you're providing the categories, use that to validate the assumptions that you have based on that open card sort, like what you thought you learned from it, to make sure the people's behavior continues to match up. And if it does, then you can move forward very confidently. If it doesn't, you might need to reevaluate or even rerun an open card sort to get a better idea of what's going on. There's also a third type called a hybrid card sort, which, as you might expect, is an open and a closed card sort all in one. So you provide categories for people, but also give them the option to create their own categories. So perhaps there were a few very well-defined categories that you made from your open card sort, but a few outlier cards that no one seemed to group in any sort of logical way. You could use a hybrid card sort to uncover that information a little bit better. And as far as making sure you have enough people to do this, you typically want at least 15 to 20 people to do a card sort, which will give you enough information without taking way too many people's time. Like if you had 100 people do the exact same card sort, you're probably wasting the time of many of those people past about 30 people. I wouldn't run a card sort with more than 30 people unless there was a distinct reason to do so. And an example of a reason to do so is, let's say you're making a very technical product, like an app or design software even. So someone who's brand new to using something like design software might think about information very differently than someone who's been using design software for 30 years. In those cases, you'd want to make multiple segments of users with about 15 to 20 people each to really understand how Regardless of the amount of technical knowledge people have, how do they think about that same information? It'd be very likely that the brand new users might think differently than the users who are like power users, experts at design software. So you'd want to uncover and understand those differences. And that's where segmenting your users or participants is a really smart idea in those particular cases. And as far as cards go themselves, there's not very many cards in my group here because I want to make this very simple for this video. And I'll actually run through me card sorting these just to do that as an example coming up next. But you typically want to cap it at about 30 cards. You can do more than 30 cards, but it becomes much, much more intense for the person doing that work. Even 30 cards on a screen at once or in front of you at once is a lot to process, and it can kind of freak people out a little bit. So try to cap it at 30 cards unless there's a very distinctive reason that you have to use more than that. And this software that I'm using right now is called Miro. They have a 30-day free trial, which is what I'm on currently. I'm mainly using it because the cards on this screen look just like Post-it notes. And if you run card sorts in person, Post-it notes are a great way of doing that. You can just write the information on the cards, tell them to sort these into groups, have them circle the groups and name what they think they are. It works fantastic. Alternatively, there's software called Optimal Workshop, which is made exclusively for doing card sorts. It's fantastic to use. I will link this in the description so you can check that out as well. And the biggest benefit to using software like Optimal Workshop is it helps with the analysis portion greatly. Like it's extremely, extremely helpful, especially with open card sorts. So with a closed card sort where you provide the categories, you can just use a spreadsheet to kind of determine how many people placed what cards in what categories. And it's actually not much work at all. You can go through that pretty quickly. When it comes to open card sorts, it's extremely typical for everyone to name every single group something differently. And what you're actually looking for is the patterns of what cards people combine together. And that's where, when it comes to something like Optimal Workshop, I'll see if I can see an analysis thing from Optimal Workshop by clicking on this, if the website chooses to load. So these are some examples of the analysis that might be a little bit small on the screen, but this is called a similarity matrix, where it'll cluster things together with darker colors. So in an example like this, the darker the blue, the more commonly people tend to group things together. So that's a helpful way of just quickly visualizing how things are grouped, and Optimal Workshop provides that by default. Also, my personal favorite is called a dendrogram, which looks sort of like tree branches. And these tree branches are combined when different cards are linked together. And when you have really thick tree branches, that's a way of the program telling you this was a pretty common group where there's a lot of overlap there. And the further the little vertical slices are here to the left, the more agreement there was in participants. So for example, this one's highlighted in green because someone moused over it, but all this information was pretty consistently grouped together. So if you were doing like a website navigation or grouping information on a product page or a design, you would want to consider grouping these together. I will say the overall grouping, like 25-ish% back here, isn't fantastic, but it's certainly better than nothing to help you understand how people are thinking about things. But back to the card sort. Sometimes showing is much better than explaining or talking about, so I'm just going to start doing a card sort here. So I have a bunch of different cars from Subaru, and I went ahead and looked at all these cars so I know what they look like before I'm doing this, which is certainly very, very helpful. But I'll just do an open card sort to start out with, and then we can go from there about how this tends to work. So I'm going to start right here with the Impreza, which is a car. So I'm going to make basically a car group. And keep in mind, this is an open card sort, so there's no rules. I can make any groups that I want. We also have the Legacy, which is a car. So I'm going to group that with the Impreza. And then let's see what we have here. We have the Crosstrek, which I personally consider to be a crossover SUV. So it's like part car, part SUV. It's essentially right in the middle of those two things. That's how I tend to think about those. And in the same way, we have the Outback, which I also consider to be a crossover SUV. So I'm going to put that right under the Crosstrek. Next up, we have the Forester, which, at least now, like what I remember a Forester being versus what it is now seems to be very different, but I just call the Forester a straight up SUV. It's a pretty big vehicle that seems much larger than the Crosstrek or the Outback, so that's why I did that. We also have the Accent, which I wasn't even aware Subaru offered until today, but that's a super big SUV, like straight up Americana style big SUV, so that's going under the Forester. And now we have the BRZ and the WRX left. These are both cars, so I could group them under the Impreza and the Legacy, which would be totally reasonable as they're all cars. But I'm actually going to make a different group for this, which is grouping these two together as essentially sports cars. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy some of these and make my category groups. I'll change the color of the actual categories to be different. So this one's cars. I'm going to call this one crossovers, followed up by the SUVs, lowercase, goodness. And then I'll make a sports cars one for the BRZ as well as the WRX. So there we have it. That is an example of an open card sort where I was able to group these however I wanted. And then from that point in time, I could make my own categories and call them what I wanted. And the great thing about a card sort that's open is you wouldn't have known what I was thinking for these categories or why I was thinking the way I was unless I went ahead and went through this. And also you are listening to me do this as I do it, which is called a moderated card sort, where you would have someone in person or perhaps remotely over something like Zoom talk through what they're thinking as they're thinking. It's super beneficial to do a moderated card sort for that reason. It's just a little bit more awkward for the person actually doing the card sort because they're going to want to please you and sound smart and all that fun stuff. So there's a bit more bias involved. That being said, I think it's generally that the benefits of that, of having someone talk through it in front of you, outweigh the negatives of them maybe being a bit more biased and a little bit more hesitant. So that's something to be mindful of. But for example, I could have also just as easily put these, the BRZ and the WRX, under cars. And if you had done a closed card sort and not included the sports cars version or the sports cars category, then I would have simply done that. And maybe you even did a closed card sort where you didn't have crossovers and you made me sort into cars or SUVs, in which case it would end up looking something kind of like this. And that shows why it's so important to start with that open card sort. Because if I was forced to pick between these two, I simply would have done this, which looks very different than what I actually ended up doing, which had two entire new categories that wouldn't have been there if I started with that closed card sort. But for example, if you ran that open card sort and there was a good percentage of people that made these four categories, then you can move forward to validate or verify your newly created categories by having people sort into them. So then I could just start over. I would actually end up sorting this the same way because I made that open card sort, but you get the idea. The open card sort kind of lets you know what the world looks like. And then the closed card sort helps you prove that the way you think, like what you think you learned from going through that open card sort, is actually how it is. And should there be any differences where things don't line up as expected, that's an opportunity to make improvements, run that closed card sort again, and make sure you're moving forward in the right way. And like I said before, it's super duper helpful to do this with about 15 to 20 people. I would cap it at about 30 people. If you were to do this with only 2 or 3 people, the chances of people being either not in agreement or there being weird outliers in terms of you might have 2 out of 3 people who think very similar, but if you were to do it with 30 people, those 2 or 3 people would be extremely different than the majority of a much wider audience. Just be mindful of that. It's important that you have enough people to make these results trustworthy, especially if you're making some important decisions. It's always better to have some information from users or the actual people participating in your product than none, but be careful not to be led down the wrong way by just simply not talking or working with enough people. But that's really it as a super high level overview of card sorting. When it comes to this, obviously the next step would be to analyze everything, which, as I said, when it comes to like a closed card sort, just make a Google sheet, make your categories, and then start writing down how many people put what card in what category. That work does itself. But if you're doing it on an open card sort, I would extraordinarily recommend using software like Optimal Workshop. They have little tutorial videos about how to analyze based on these things. It'll save you an immense amount of time. It's very difficult to analyze open card sorts without software like this. It can be done. It just takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, where this will save you all of that up front. So big recommendation, use Optimal Workshop if you're doing the card sorts. Their free version, it caps with 30 cards, which is perfect. and 10 participants, which isn't perfect. I'd much rather have like 15 to 20, but 10, if there's really strong agreement, can be enough to move forward. And if you do have diverse user groups, like new users, intermediate users, advanced users, you can do 3 card sorts, still working within the free plan of 10 each for each one of those distinct user types. And that's actually a great way of kind of getting around the need to pay here while still getting some incredible insight. Of course, it's great software. You should pay for great software. So if there's a reason for you to go beyond the free plan and you can do that, by all means do so to support this company. It's cool that they make this software to make this easy. And last thing before I end this video, there's a website called Nielsen Norman Group, nngroup.com, which is both one of the oldest user experience websites or sources of information online, and also one of the very, very best. They do have a card sorting page where you can learn some more in-depth information than what I've given you right here, but a huge recommendation to check them out. They're a stunningly good resource for all things user experience. So definitely check them out, give them a look. There's a lot to learn here, and shout out to them for helping me learn a lot as I've transitioned into working as a UX researcher. But that is really it for this video. First off, thank you so much for taking your time to watch. And if you do have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those in the comments section. And as always, if you want to see more stuff like this, please subscribe. It helps me out. And also hit the thumbs up button if the information was helpful. It just lets me know that I'm doing a good job. Of course, if this was confusing and not helpful, you can feel free to hit the thumbs down button. Although, thanks for listening all the way. Even if you hit the thumbs down button, it's impressive you made it this far. But that's really it for me. Thanks so much for watching. Until the next video.